الفاتحة. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد سيد الأولين والآخرين. مدد يا رسول، مدد يا سادة أصحاب يا شيخنا دستور مولانا إن شاء الله فاز الشيخ محمد طريقتنا الصحبة والخير في الجمعية. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يريد الله أن يخفف عنكم وخلق الإنسان ضعيفا. صدق الله العظيم. Allah Azze ve Celle insanlara takatı getiremeyecekler şeyleri yüklemek istemiyor diyor.
Allah Almighty does not want to burden people with things which they cannot carry.
Allah Azze ve Celle insan zayıf, yani
Allah Almighty has created the human being weak.
yaratıldı. İnsan ne kadar kendini kuvvetli zannederse zayıftır.
No matter how strong you think you are weak.
Hem beden olarak
A person is weak from a physical perspective.
zayıftır. Başka mahlukata göre kuvvet olarak, yani onlarla yarışmaya kalksa
When compared to other beings or other creatures of Allah Almighty, when a person was to compete from a physical perspective with other creatures,
onları yaptıklarını yapamaz.
a person could not compete with other creatures from a physical perspective and could not do what they can do.
Maddi olarak, manevi olarak da nefsine yenildiği için zayıftır.
And also from a spiritual perspective, human beings are weak because they lose against their egos.
Manevi olan, mühim olan.
What is important, however, is to take care of one's spirituality.
Maddi olan mühim değil.
It's not so important when it comes to your physical being.
Şimdi çoğu şeyler şöyle yaparım, böyle yaparım. Ne kadar yapsan insanın nadir olarak bazı insanlar var, hayvanlardan daha kuvvetli olan.
And people claim to be capable of so many things, and there are in fact a rare people who may do things from a physical perspective which an animal could not do.
Nadir insanlar var. Ama manevi olarak hepsinden kuvvetlidir.
And they are only, when it comes to competing with, for example, animals from a physical perspective, there may be some people who may be more capable than an animal, but from a spiritual perspective, human beings are superior.
Allah Azze ve Celle'nin emrettiği gibi giderse manevi kuvvet maddi kuvvetle beraber onu kimse yenemez.
But if you follow the way of Allah Almighty, this will provide you with a spiritual strength, and with that spiritual strength that comes by the following the way of Allah Almighty, you will also obtain physical, worldly strength, and you will be in a state where you cannot be beaten.
Hepsinden daha kuvvetli olur.
And then you are in a state where you are more powerful than anyone else.
Öteki türlü hem nefsine yenilmiş olur.
But if you give in to your ego, you will be losing from a spiritual perspective against your ego.
De her şeyi kaybetmiş olur.
And by losing your spirituality, you will be losing everything.
Şimdiki insanlar maalesef hepsi nefsine yenilmiş, nefsine köle olmuş.
People today, unfortunately, have all become victims of their egos. They have lost against their egos. They have been defeated by their egos.
Nefsinin istediğini yapıyor.
They do as their egos desire.
Allah Azze ve Celle'ye karşı geliyor, kendini kuvvetli zannediyor.
Thus, they oppose Allah Almighty and yet think of themselves to be powerful ones.
Halbuki Allah Azze ve Celle insanlara o yükü kaldırsın istiyor. Allah Azze ve Celle insanları da hafifletsin istiyor. O günah yükünün altında ezilmesinler.
But Allah Almighty does not want people to be crushed by the heavy burden of their sins. Allah Almighty wants to lift the heavy burden of sins people have accumulated on themselves and to release them from this heavy burden of sins.
Günahın yükü çok ağırdır.
The weight of the burden of sins is heavy.
Görünmüyor ama çok büyük bir yüktür.
The burden of sins cannot be seen, but it is a huge burden which is very heavy.
Tonlarca, yüz binlerce ton oluyor insanın üstüne ama
its weight is more than 100,000 of tons.
O farkında değil.
But people are unaware of it.
Zannediyor ki ben iyilik yapıyorum.
People, while they commit sins, still think that they would be doing something good.
Hele şimdiki zamanda Allah muhafaza etsin. Şeytanla nefesi iyicene insanları azdırmış.
And now may Allah Almighty protect. These days, in this time we now live in, it's become even worse, where Shaitan and the devil have joined forces and have gone wild and have made people go wild.
Allah Azze ve Celle'ye karşı da
and people have lost their manners and they are opposing Allah Almighty.
edepsizlik yapıyorlar.
They have lost their good behavior towards Allah Almighty.
Kendilerini bir şey zannediyorlar.
And while they oppose Allah Almighty, they think of themselves of being something.
Halbuki Allah Azze ve Celle sen zayıf yarattım seni.
But Allah Almighty says, I have created you weak.
Hulikal insan zayıfa.
People are created weak.
Zayıf yaratılmışsın. Zayıfsın.
You are weak.
Sen istediğin kadar bağır. Sen kimsin?
No matter how much you shout, no matter how much you claim to be something,
Toz bile olamazsın. Sen
you are not even a piece of dust.
değilsen senin bu yeryüzü bile bu kainatın içinde toz kadar bile değil.
Within the universe, on this earth, you are not even a piece of dust.
Bir de kalkıp da Allah Azze ve Celle'ye karşı geliyorsun.
Still, you claim to be something and oppose Allah Almighty.
Şudur, bu budur diye.
And you take the right to make judgments.
Allah'ın azametini bilmiyorsun.
Are you unaware of the greatness of Allah Almighty?
Sen kendi kendine zarar veriyorsun.
And you are harming yourself by what you are doing.
Allah muhafaza etsin bu.
May Allah Almighty protect us
Nefsin şerrinden.
from the evil of our egos.
Onun için men arife nefse arife rabbah. Kendini bilen Allah Azze ve Celle'yi bilir diyor.
Therefore, those who knows himself knows his Lord Allah Almighty.
Yani kendini ne kadar zayıf olduğunu bilip Allah'a tevazu eden o vakit Allah.
So we need to know who we are by knowing how weak we are in order to know the greatness of Allah Almighty.
Bilmiş olur. Öteki türlü bilmeden
And by realizing how weak we are, we will be realizing Allah Almighty and His greatness.
cahil kendini de okumuş zannediyor.
But if we do not start realizing how weak we are just increasing our ignorance no matter how much we may have studied.
Üniversiteler bitirdik, şu yaptık, bu yaptık.
People think of themselves and have become arrogant and think of themselves to be something by saying, I've graduated from this and that university.
Sen zor cahilsin.
But you are a complete ignorant person.
Yani bırak şeyi, senin nesin bu kainatın içinde, senin koca dünyan bile zerre kadar bile değil.
Without knowing who you are and without knowing the reality of Allah Almighty saying that you are weak and without admitting your weakness, you are nothing, and you are in fact nothing compared to the greatness and vastness of the universe, and you are not even, compared to this world, you are not even a piece of dust.
Kalkıp da sen şey yapıyorsun, Allah'a karşı gelirsin.
But still you insist on opposing Allah Almighty.
Allah akıl fikir versin diyeceğiz.
All we can say is, may Allah Almighty give people a mind and a reason to think.
Cahil insanlar,
These are ignorant people,
zayıf insanlar.
weak people.
Allah bize kuvvet versin,
May Allah Almighty give us the strength of faith.
iman kuvvet versin inşallah. Ve minallah tevfik. El-Fatiha.